Welcome to the video on chapter 2 for social psychology. This is the chapter on social cognition. Social cognition is half of the field of social psychology. It's about how we think about others. And I know if you're hearing me talk face-to-face in class, you're going to hear me talk about doing psychotherapy, because I also have a private practice working with clients. And a lot of misery is based on poor social cognition. It's attributions and explanations we make about other people's behavior that may not be based in any sort of fact at all. So our social cognitions are how we think about other people and how we understand them and how we predict their behaviors. But so frequently it's faulty. This chapter has a fair amount to do with that. The first set of information, oops, I need to put this to full screen. There we go. The first thing about social cognition is that we consider the human mind to basically have two major styles. One is quick, automatic, reflexive, and that is more like our animal nature. I mean, that's like if we have a sudden instinct or impulse to react to whatever's happening in our environment. That's the first process. Sometimes that can be good for survival, but we need the second one. And because we're human beings, we've evolved to develop this frontal lobe here. This is the front part of our brain, which if you've had me for general psychology, you know that's the part where Phineas Gage had that knocked off line. But we know from case studies like that and all sorts of fMRI studies that this part of the brain is active in complex thinking, in projecting ourselves into the future, in making moral judgments, in regulating our emotions, and basically saying like, okay, I may have this gut instinct to react aggressively towards a person, but I can use this frontal lobe here. And that's the second one, which is a conscious, slower, thoughtful process, which can really slow us down. It's really important we have the second process, because this can go a long way to helping us really shift even what our automatic responses are. So when it comes to being aggressive, we can learn. Actually, that's why they have anger management courses, that you can recognize, oh, I'm having this impulse, and use that conscious, thoughtful, slow mind to say, no, I'm not going to have to react that way. Same when it comes to prejudice and racism. If a person's gut instinct is to make stereotypes and be prejudiced, a human being can use their second thought, the slow process, to say, wait a minute, put on the brakes. Is that accurate? Is that real? And start to shift their automatic thinking. So these are going to be important. It's an important idea that we're going to talk about throughout the rest of the semester. I'm shifting gears to talk about learning theory, which hopefully you've had in introductory psychology. You may remember associational learning is also classical conditioning, Pavlov's dogs. It's paired, having associations are paired things, so that when you smell like popcorn, your mouth starts to water because you love popcorn, and you know they're connected. I know that, and so when you think about social cognition, I mean, it's a basic sort of learning, and all learning theory is really boiled down to association learning, also called classical conditioning, operant learning, rewards and punishments, and observational learning. A lot of advertisers use associational learning or classical conditioning by trying to make us laugh when they show us commercials. If they can get a positive emotion in us associated with a product they're presenting to us, if we have that pairing happen in our mind, that's an association that's been formed, and we'll have a positive reaction to that product when we see it later on. Observational learning is just learning by watching others. That's probably the most basic. And as again, I'm not going to go into detail on this because you've had this before. The operant conditioning is about rewards and punishment. One thing about learning that you probably have not had before, if you haven't had much other psychology in terms of courses, are what schemas are. Schemas are our mental categories, the mental containers we use to make sense of the world. One of the first American psychologists, William James, said that if you think about a newborn infant just coming into the world, and it's just, there's so much stimulation trying to make sense of it, and we start to develop mental categories. That is like mom's face, that is associated with care and feeding, that is pillow. That's associated with, we start to break down the world into the most basic schemas. They're mental structures based on our prior knowledge. We need these to make sense of the world. We have these for scripts for going into a classroom. Actually, this has been changed given the coronavirus. Our schemas for what a classroom used to be like, our schemas have to change. We actually have to change our schemas. And there's a couple of ways we do that. We can do that with accommodation. That is when our experiences make us rearrange and redefine our schemas, or assimilation. Assimilation is when we go into a situation and we impose our current schemas onto a new situation to try to make sense of it. And that's just human nature, to try to like use how we know the world to make sense. So if you were ever to take how you know about how to operate where you live right now into a foreign country, if you were to travel to a foreign country and try to make sense of how are parent-child relations, how do they work? What does it mean to go into a bank and to a grocery store? We would probably use assimilation most of all. But sometimes there are things that we have to accommodate. Our experiences make us redefine our schemas. And I'm going to go back to stereotypes and prejudice again. If a person is walking around with a whole bunch of negative stereotypes and prejudice, what they need is accommodation. And that takes, actually, when we get to the chapter on prejudice, we're going to see it takes repeated experiences, and until they're overwhelmed and they realize that my schemas don't work. But that takes a lot of experience to break those down, unless a person is naturally open, and that is a personality style, which makes a person say, hey, maybe my schemas need to be changed from the get-go. Most of us will start with assimilation, saying I'm going to impose my current schemas, the way I know the world, onto my new interaction I'm having right now. I did put this, oops, I'm going back. Let me go back here. That's the wrong way. We talk about schemas. There are also scripts. And I just use this as an example. You'll see this in the book. Scripts are special schemas where events typically take place in a certain order and time. So most people will be able to look at this whole set of pictures and put them in order about what it means to go into a restaurant, be seated, place an order, get your food, eat it, pay for it, and leave. So, I mean, because most of us have been to a restaurant, we have that schema of it. Schemas are persistent and pervasive. They stick with us. One example of that is a study described in your book where they had participants sign up for study, and they said, we want you to read these suicide notes. It was kind of a morbid study. And said, there's 25 pairs, and in these pairs, one's a real suicide notes and one's a fake one. Pick one, which one's real and which one's not. So these people did that. Then they either gave them, or they actually gave them feedback, said you did horribly or you did really, really well. And they're like, oh, okay. When you tell them that, like, actually we lied, you didn't do that poorly, or you didn't do that well, you did just average like everybody else does. If you say, okay, now we're going to give this test to you again, how are you going to perform? What happens is that schema had been activated, first of all, when they had been told they had done really well. If that happened, they said, I'm going to do really well the second time. If they'd been told that they did poorly initially, they say, I probably won't do very good. But they'd all been told that the feedback they had been given was false, that they had been lied to by the researchers about how well they had originally done. But the schema is persistent. Oh, I'm good at this task, or I'm poor at this task. And even though when they were told, we gave you false information, they still use that to predict their future performance on that task. There's another way the schemas are pervasive, and that is in terms of the confirmation bias. This is the idea that we have our schemas going into the world, and we just look for evidence to confirm those. Famous study described in your book describes a little girl by the name of Hannah. I've talked about this in my introductory psychology class, where the same girl, this picture, and so you have a whole bunch of, actually the original study was done with school teachers. And you show these teachers a picture of this young girl, and it's the same girl. Half the teachers see a picture of her where she's pictured in front of a rich home. She's got real nice clothes on, a nice car in the driveway. The other half of the teachers see the same girl, but she's in raggedy clothes, a car that's falling apart in the driveway, and kind of a poor looking house. Then they take all the teachers into a room, so half had seen one picture, half had seen the other. take them into this room and say, we want you to watch this video of her taking an intelligence test. They all watched the same like 10-minute video. What they didn't know is and researchers, when they filmed Hannah taking her intelligence test, they told her half the time, do really well, answer the questions right, and pay attention. And then half the time, we want you to be distracted, get questions wrong, play with your shoe, look out the window. And so Hannah did that during that 10 minutes. Half the time she was on task, half the time she was messing up. They went to the teachers afterwards and said, how well did Hannah do on that test? They all saw the same video where half the time she did good and half the time she did poorly. So everyone should have said average because half the time she did well enough. That's not what happened. And you can predict what happened. Is that the teachers who had originally seen her in a photo in front of a rich house said she did really well. And the ones who had seen her in front of a poor house said she didn't do very well. The kicker is they followed up and said, why? Why did you say that? And the people who had seen her in front of a poorhouse, they looked for the evidence in that video where she was screwing up. They said, didn't you see her screwing up? She was looking out the window, playing with her shoe, getting questions wrong. And the ones who had seen her in front of the rich house said, well, didn't you see her in that video? She was answering questions, paying attention, being really polite. It's like, basically, these teachers were looking for evidence to confirm their original bias and schema that had been activated. And this is called confirmation bias, and it's a real problem. Schemas can be activated and called mentally primed. This is an interesting study described in your book where students either unscrambled words, where you would take all the letters in a word and scramble them, and you're asked to unscramble them, make words. Some were just random words, and then another group of students got words that were related to being old, physically old. And then later they just, when they were done, they said, okay, now we need you to take this paperwork and turn it in down to the secretary down the hall. They timed how long it took them to walk down the hall. If the students had actually unscrambled the words that were related to being elderly and old, they took longer. And the researchers concluded that that was the only thing that the two groups had been treated differently, that was the one factor that primed a schema about being old that made them move more slowly. Kind of a strange study, actually. Another famous study in terms of how schemas work in terms of affecting behavior. There's something called the self-fulfilling prophecy, and I have here in the notes. You have an expectation about someone, and then you treat them in a way that's consistent with your expectations. So if I expect you to be just rude and nasty, and so I'm just real like, I don't really want to talk to you anyway, that's probably going to make you want to be a little bit more nasty with me. So what happens is I have this expectation of you, I treat you in a way that's consistent with that, and that leads you to respond to me in that way that I'm expecting. A famous study was done where teachers, once again, were told at the beginning of the year, said, let me see your grade book. And they said, oh yeah, this kid, this kid, this kid in the grade, they're going to do really well this year. And then they went away, and then at the end of the semester, they came back and said, can we see the performance sheets on how well these kids had done? And just as they predicted, this kid, this kid, this kid did really well. What they didn't tell the teachers is they randomly picked those kids in the grade book. It wasn't based on any testing. They had told the teachers they were going to do really well. But what they found is the teachers had been cued that these students were going to do well. They were called bloomers because they were going to bloom and grow. And so the teachers treated those kids like they were smart and like that they could respond well. This affects behavior in a dramatic way in the classroom. And I would wish that every teacher would know this research so they could treat every student the same and expect high and good behavior and performance out of all their students. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about shortcuts that we take, because again, this is all about social cognition. We do it as human beings. We do it as human beings because we're cognitive misers. Cognitive misers, I know my face is blocking this whole definition, but basically, cognitive miser means that we as human beings don't want to think too much. We don't want to think too hard or too complexly about an issue. So if we don't have to, we won't. We'll use shortcuts. A lot of times we're just too tired. We're too busy. Because it takes a lot to think complexly about every social interaction we have. So we use rules of thumb, stereotypes, shortcuts to predict what we're going to get out of a person. One of the shortcuts we use is the availability heuristic. It's like, what have we been exposed to recently? And that's just what's on our mind. So we will come up with that and think, oh, that's what's happening now, even though something like that may not be very common. I put up here that doctors can be affected by this. So if you think back to the coronavirus, lately that's been so common. Someone comes in with a cough and sore throat. Probably most doctors are going to be like, let's get you tested for the coronavirus. You probably think that's probably what you have. It might be strep throat, but because it's so available in their mind, they're readily and immediately applying that. So when things are easy to bring to mind, people will often think that's what's going on, but most of the time it takes more complex thinking, like what can you assess and diagnose more thoroughly before you draw a final conclusion. Hindsight bias and counterfactual thing. Hindsight bias is like, yeah, I knew that. Yeah, I knew that was going to happen. And human beings often do this. That's why when we're doing scientific research, we have to make predictions before we collect any data. Because otherwise you could just go like, I don't know, but let's go see if these two things are related. And then the results would come back and be like, oh, I knew that. And we would use hindsight bias. It's like, that's not the way science changes and works. You have to make a prediction before you go in. Otherwise, it's crap science. One other thing that happens to most human beings is counterfactual thinking. And we evaluate the meaning of negative and unexpected events by thinking of other outcomes that are easy to imagine. So if you had a fender bender car accident, you think like, oh, if I had just not taken that phone call and left 2 minutes earlier, I would have avoided that whole car accident. Sometimes researchers think this is a way to try to get more predictability and control in our environment. But typically, I don't think it's a very healthy or good thing, because counterfactual thinking is going against the facts. It's not, I don't know, I think it leads to more problems in terms of mental health than good things. Another mental shortcut that we use in terms of our social cognition is the false consensus effect. Thinking if I do this much, then probably most other people do the same thing. So consensus mean everyone, but it's false, because not everyone operates the same way that we do. So if you think that, okay, I do 3 loads of laundry a week, you're gonna think, oh, probably most people do that too. No, not the way it works. How often do you eat out at fast food? You're probably gonna think other people do that too. How much do you spend time studying? You're gonna think other students in your class do that too. How much time do you spend playing video games? You're probably gonna think other people do that too. We use ourselves as a base, which is not a good or accurate thing to do. And so those are a few mental shortcuts. There's also some material that I'd like you to pay attention to that's mentioned on the study guide in relation to the representative heuristic and also to eyewitness testimony. I don't have time to talk about this because I've gone over my 15-minute time limit already. I hope this video has been helpful.